The silence in the grand ballroom of the Kensington Palace wasn't just quiet, it was terrified. Just seconds ago, Duke Julian had laughed in his wife's face, calling her a penniless nobody in front of London's elite. He held his mistress's hand, thinking he had won. But then the heavy oak doors groaned open. The visiting Emperor of Austria didn't walk toward the king. He didn't walk toward the Prime Minister. He walked straight toward the trembling woman in the corner, Julian's worthless wife, and dropped to both knees, pressing his forehead to the floor. "Forgive us, Your Imperial Highness." The Emperor wept. "We have searched the world for you." Julian's glass shattered on the floor, but the sound was drowned out by the realization that he had just enslaved a queen. The rain in London did not wash away the grime of the city. It merely made the cobblestones slick and treacherous, much like the atmosphere inside Blackwood Manor. Elara stood by the tall, drafty window of the drawing room, her reflection a pale ghost against the darkening glass. She wore a dress of simple gray wool, lacking the intricate embroidery and lace that adorned the gowns of the women her husband Julian Blackwood, the Duke of Ashford, preferred to entertain. "Must you stand there like a spectre, Elara?" The voice cut through the silence like a whip. Julian strode into the room, tossing his riding gloves onto a mahogany table with a careless thud. He was a handsome man, objectively speaking tall, with hair the color of midnight and eyes like cold steel, but his cruelty had warped his features in Elara's eyes. "I was merely waiting for your return, my lord," Elara said softly, turning to face him. "Cook has prepared the venison you enjoy." Julian sneered, pouring himself a glass of brandy without offering her a drop. "I will not be dining here tonight. I have an engagement at Lady Genevieve's salon, a place where the conversation is actually stimulating and the women know how to dress for their station." Elara felt the familiar sting of humiliation, but she kept her face impassive. It had been 2 years since their marriage, a union arranged by Julian's father before his death to settle a gambling debt owed to Elara's late guardian, a reclusive merchant named Arthur Vance. Julian had resented the marriage from the moment the ink dried. He saw Elara as a burden, a commoner with no pedigree, no title, and no fortune other than the cleared debt. "Julian," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "it is our anniversary." He paused, the glass halfway to his lips, and then let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "And do you expect a celebration, a gift?" He walked closer to her, looming over her petite frame. "Let us be clear, Elara. You are the Duchess of Ashford in name only. You have no status. You bring no alliances to this house. You are a merchant's ward who got lucky. Do not embarrass me by pretending we are a real match." "I am your wife," she whispered, her chin lifting slightly. "And I bear the Ashford name with more dignity than you bear your vows." His eyes narrowed. For a second she thought he might strike her. Instead, he leaned in, his breath smelling of expensive spirits. "Dignity. You wouldn't know the meaning of the word. You are invisible, Elara. The tone tolerates you because of me. Without my title, you are nothing but a gutter rat Arthur Vance took pity on. Remember that." He finished his drink in one gulp, set the glass down with a heavy clink, and stormed out. The heavy front door slammed, shaking the portraits of his ancestors on the walls, ancestors who seemed to look down on Elara with the same disdain as their descendant. Elara waited until the sound of his carriage faded into the rainy night. Only then did she allow her shoulders to slump. She walked over to the small locked bureau in the corner of the room, the only piece of furniture she had brought with her from her guardian's home. She pulled a small key from a chain hidden beneath her bodice and unlocked the drawer. Inside lay a bundle of letters tied with a faded purple ribbon and a heavy signet ring bearing a crest that did not belong to any English house, a double-headed eagle clutching a sword and a lily. "Invisible," she murmured, tracing the cold gold of the ring. "If only you knew, Julian. Invisibility is the only thing keeping you alive." She was not Elara Vance. That name was a construct, a shield forged by loyalists to protect a child smuggled out of a burning palace 20 years ago during the Great Coup of Valoria. She was Grand Duchess Anastasia Elara von Habsburg-Lorraine, the sole survivor of the royal house of Valoria. But to the world and to her cruel husband, she was just the boring, statusless wife waiting at home. The following morning, the atmosphere in London shifted. The gray gloom was replaced by a frantic energy that buzzed through the streets and seeped into the parlors of the elite. At breakfast, Julian was nursing a headache, his mood fouler than usual. Alara sat at the opposite end of the long dining table, silently buttering a piece of toast. The butler, an elderly man named Henderson, who was one of the few people to treat Alara with kindness, entered with a silver tray. "The Morning Post, Your Grace," Henderson said, bowing, "and a special missive from the palace." Julian's eyes snapped open. He snatched the envelope, breaking the royal wax seal with eager fingers. As he read, his posture straightened, the hangover forgotten. "Incredible," he muttered. "The rumors were true." "What is it?" Alara asked politely. Julian looked at her as if surprised she was still there. "King George is hosting a grand ball at Windsor 3 days from now. It is in honor of the visiting diplomatic envoy from the East, the newly restored Empire of Valoria." Ilara's knife froze against her toast. The clatter of silverware against china sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Valoria. The regime that had slaughtered her family had fallen 3 years ago, consumed by its own corruption. She knew the loyalist forces had retaken the capital, but she had remained in hiding, unsure if the new provisional government was friend or foe. "The general, pardon, the Prime Minister of Valoria is coming to sign a trade treaty." Julian continued scanning the letter. "The invitation says they are looking for lost cultural ties." He stood up, pacing the room. "This is my chance. If I can secure a trade deal for the Blackwood shipping lines with Valoria, I will be the richest duke in England. I need to impress them." He rang the bell violently. "Henderson, send a runner to Madame Dubois' boutique. Tell her I need her finest silk gown ready by tomorrow evening." Alara felt a flicker of warmth. Perhaps he intended to take her. Perhaps he realized that as a duchess, she should be by his side. "And Henderson," Julian added, "make sure the gown is fitted for Lady Genevieve. She has a waist that deserves such silk." The warmth in Ilara's chest turned to ice. "You intend to take your mistress to a royal ball at Windsor?" she asked, her voice deadly calm. "While your wife sits at home." Julian laughed, a cruel barking sound. "Don't be absurd, Ilara. I cannot take you. Look at you." He gestured vaguely at her simple dress. "You have no wit, no charm, and certainly no understanding of international politics. Genevieve is the daughter of an earl. She knows how to charm diplomats. You would only stand in the corner and embarrass me with your silence." "I am the Duchess of Ashford." Alara stood up, her hands trembling not with fear but with suppressed rage. "Protocol demands you bring your wife. The king will notice. The king won't care who is on my arm as long as she is beautiful." Julian sneered. "And the Valorians? They are warriors and scholars. They have no time for a mouse like you. You will stay here, Alara. You will stay here and ensure the servants polish the silver for when I return victorious." He grabbed his coat and left, leaving the invitation on the table. Ilara walked slowly toward it. She picked up the heavy cream card. The calligraphy was elegant, but it was the seal at the bottom that made her breath hitch. It wasn't just the British royal seal. Beside it was the Valorian crest, the double-headed eagle. But there was a detail Julian had missed. A tiny, almost imperceptible marking in the ink, a symbol of a lily woven into the eagle's talons. It was a code, a signal used by the royal guard of her father's court. It meant the search is active. The heir is safe to reveal. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The new government wasn't just a provisional council. The Prime Minister coming to London wasn't a politician. She recognized the name signed at the bottom, Victor Crumb. Victor, her father's most loyal general, the man who had carried her on his back through the snow when she was 5 years old. He wasn't coming for trade. He was coming for her. Alara looked at the empty doorway where her husband had just exited to buy a dress for another woman. A cold, regal smile touched her lips for the first time in years. You are right, Julian, she whispered to the empty room. The mouse will stay home. But the lioness is going to Windsor. She turned to Henderson, who was hovering by the sideboard looking heartbroken for his mistress. Henderson, she said, her voice changing. The timid wobble was gone. In its place was a tone of absolute command, a voice that had been trained to order armies before she was 10. Yes, Your Grace. Prepare the carriage for tonight. Not the Duke's carriage, the old hooded phaeton in the back. Ma'am, where are you going? To the docks, Elara said, her eyes flashing like diamonds. I have a dress to commission, and it will not be from Madame de Bois. She needed to find the one man in London who knew who she really was. A jeweler named Elias Thorne, hiding in the slums of Whitechapel, guarding the crown jewels of Valoria in a biscuit tin under his floorboards. It was time to dress for her status. Whitechapel was a festering wound in the side of London, a place where the fog tasted of coal and desperation. It was no place for a duchess. Yet Elara moved through the shadowed alleys with a grace that defied the filth around her. She wore a heavy cloak, the hood pulled low, concealing her face. She stopped before a dilapidated shop with a sign that read Thorne's Clock Repair. The windows were grimy, but inside a single candle flickered. Elara knocked 3 times, 2 quick, 1 slow, a rhythm from a childhood nursery rhyme. The door creaked open, revealing a hunched old man with spectacles thick as bottle bottoms. He squinted at her, suspicion etched into his wrinkles. We are closed. No clocks fixed tonight. Elara pulled back her hood. Hello, Elias. The old man dropped the wrench he was holding. It clattered loudly on the floorboards. He stared, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Tears instantly welled in his milky eyes. He fell to his knees, disregarding the sawdust and oil on the floor. Your Imperial Highness, he choked out, bowing his head so low his forehead touched her muddy boots. Princess Anastasia. Rise, Elias, she said gently, helping him up. We have no time for titles tonight. I need the package. Elias scrambled to his feet, locking the door and rushing to the back of the shop. He pulled up a loose floorboard beneath his workbench and retrieved a rusted iron box. With trembling hands he placed it on the table. I have guarded them with my life for 15 years, Princess. I never sold a single stone even when I was starving. Elara opened the box. Inside, wrapped in dirty rags, lay the fire of Valoria, a necklace of rubies so dark they looked like crystallized blood surrounded by diamonds the size of quail eggs. Beside it lay the tiara of the lily, a delicate, towering masterpiece of platinum and sapphires. These were not just jewels. They were the symbol of supreme authority in her homeland. They are beautiful, Elias, she said softly. But I need more than jewels. I need a gown, one that speaks of a kingdom reborn. Elias wiped his eyes. My niece. She is a seamstress for the Royal Opera House. She is talented but poor. She will work day and night if I ask her. Good, Elara said, her gaze hardening. Tell her I need a dress of deep crimson velvet, the color of the Valorian banner, and gold thread, lots of it. I want the crest embroidered on the train, but subtle, visible only when I walk. For the ball, Elias asked. For the war, Elara corrected. My husband thinks I am a nobody. On Friday night I intend to show him exactly who he married. Meanwhile, across the city, Julian was holding court at Lady Genevieve's salon. The room was filled with laughter and the clinking of crystal. Genevieve, a striking blonde with eyes that calculated everyone's net worth, was modeling the pale pink silk Julian had purchased. It is exquisite, darling, Genevieve purred, tracing a finger down Julian's lapel. Far too good to be wasted on that drab little wife of yours. Julian chuckled, sipping his champagne. Elara, she wouldn't know what to do with such a dress. She'd probably spill tea on it. No, my dear, you will be the star of Windsor. When I present you to the Valorian Prime Minister, he will see that the Duke of Ashford surrounds himself with quality. And what of the Duchess? A guest asked a smirking Viscount. Will she not be offended? Let her be offended. Julian waved his hand dismissively. She has no status, no family to complain to. She is lucky I keep a roof over her head. If she causes a scene, I'll simply send her to the country estate. Perhaps permanently. The room erupted in laughter. Julian basked in it, feeling powerful, feeling invincible. He had no idea that across the city, the drab little wife was currently fitting a tiara worth more than his entire estate upon her head, her eyes burning with a promise of retribution. The night of the grand ball arrived with a clear, starry sky. Windsor Castle was ablaze with light, every window glowing like a beacon. The driveway was clogged with carriages bearing the crests of the most powerful families in Europe. Julian Blackwood stepped out of his black carriage looking dashing in his formal attire. On his arm was Lady Genevieve, radiant in her pink silk, dripping in jewels that Julian had bought on credit. They made a striking couple, and heads turned as they ascended the grand staircase. "Relax, Julian," Genevieve whispered. "Everyone is looking at us." "As they should," Julian replied arrogantly. "Tonight we secure the contract, and then, my dear, perhaps I will finally look into an annulment. I am tired of the dead weight at home." They entered the ballroom. It was a sea of color and noise. The orchestra played a sweeping waltz from the balcony. At the far end of the room, on a raised dais, sat King George of England. Beside him stood a group of men in sharp military uniforms of black and gold, the Valorian delegation. The man in the center was terrifying. Prime Minister Victor Crumb was a giant of a man with a scar running down his cheek and a gaze that seemed to weigh every soul in the room. He wasn't smiling. He was scanning the crowd, searching. Julian adjusted his cuffs. "Wait here, Genevieve. I will make the introduction." He pushed his way through the crowd, confident, rehearsed. But before he could reach the dais, a hush began to fall over the room. It started at the entrance and rippled outward like a wave. The music faltered and died. The chatter stopped. Julian turned annoyed. What is the distraction? Then he saw her. At the top of the grand staircase stood a woman. But it wasn't just a woman. It was a vision. She wore a gown of crimson velvet that seemed to absorb the light, hugging a figure that was regal and commanding. The bodice was encrusted with gold thread that shimmered like fire. Her hair, usually pulled back in a severe bun, cascaded in dark, glossy waves down her back. And on her head sat the tiara of the lily. The crowd parted instinctively. Whispers broke out like wildfire. "Who is that? Is that a foreign queen? Look at those rubies." Julian squinted. The woman looked familiar. The curve of her jaw, the way she held her head. But it couldn't be. It was impossible. The woman began to descend the stairs. She didn't walk. She glided. Every step was deliberate, terrifyingly graceful. She looked straight ahead, her eyes locked on the dais where the Valorian delegation stood. As she reached the bottom step, she passed within 5 feet of Julian. He froze. The perfume. It was the same lavender soap Alara used, but layered with something exotic and expensive. "Alara," he whispered, his voice cracking with disbelief. She didn't even turn her head. She walked past him as if he were a piece of furniture, the long train of her crimson dress brushing against his polished shoes. The insult was so absolute, so public, that Julian felt the blood drain from his face. "That's your wife," Genevieve hissed, clutching his arm, her nails digging in. "You said she was a dowdy nobody. She looks like an empress." Alara continued her path through the parted crowd. She stopped 10 paces from the dais. The King of England looked confused, leaning forward. But on the dais, the reaction was different. Prime Minister Victor Crumb, the Stone General, the man who had stared down armies, went pale. His hands began to shake. He stepped forward, stumbling slightly, ignoring the protocol, ignoring the king beside him. He walked down the steps of the dais, his boots heavy on the wood. He stopped in front of Alara. The entire room held its breath. Julian watched, his heart hammering. "She's going to be arrested," he thought frantically. "She stole those jewels. She's impersonating royalty. I'm ruined." Victor looked into Alara's eyes. Tears streamed down the scarred warrior's face. "We thought the fire took you," Victor rasped, his voice booming in the silent hall. "We found only your ribbon in the ashes." "The fire takes only what is dead, Victor," Alara said, her voice clear and bell-like, carrying to the rafters. "I survived." Victor Crumb drew his sword. The crowd gasped. The guard stepped forward, but Victor didn't attack. He reversed the blade, holding the hilt toward her, and dropped to both knees with a crash that shook the floor. "Long live the Empress!" Victor roared. Behind him, the entire Valorian delegation, 12 hardened generals and diplomats, fell to their knees in unison. "Long live the Empress!" King George stood up, his eyes wide. He looked from the kneeling men to the woman in red, and then slowly the King of England bowed his head in respect. Julian stood paralyzed. The glass of champagne slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor. The sound echoed in the silence. Alara slowly turned her head. Her eyes found Julian across the room. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She looked at him with a chilling, detached pity. She wasn't Alara Vance, the unwanted wife. She was the blood of the dragon, and she had just burned Julian's world to the ground without striking a match. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that smothered even the candlelight. King George VI, a man known for his composure during the Blitz, looked visibly shaken. He stepped down from the dais, his eyes fixed on the ruby necklace around Alara's neck, the Fire of Valoria, a legendary artifact thought lost to history. "Your Imperial Highness?" The king said, his voice respectful but cautious. "We were told the Valorian line had been extinguished." "A fire can smolder beneath the ash for a long time, Your Majesty," Alara replied, dipping into a curtsy that was so flawless, so deeply ingrained in ancient court protocol, that it put every debutante in the room to shame. "I have lived in your country as a guest under the protection of the name Vance. I apologize for the deception. Survival required silence." "Survival?" Julian's voice cracked through the air like a whip. The shock had worn off, replaced by a surge of desperate, greedy adrenaline. He saw the bowing generals. He saw the king's respect. He saw the jewels. And his mind, warped by years of entitlement, didn't see a woman he had wronged. He saw an asset he owned. He shoved past a stunned Duchess of York and marched into the center of the circle. "This is preposterous, Imperial Highness. This is Alara Blackwood. She is my wife. She is a commoner I plucked from obscurity." Victor Crumb rose from his knees. The movement was slow, like a mountain shifting. He turned to face Julian, his hand resting heavily on the hilt of his sword. "Take another step, Duke of Ashford, and it will be your last." "She is my property by English law." Julian shouted, his face flushing red. He looked around the room, seeking allies, but the crowd recoiled from him. "Alara, tell them you are my wife! Tell them to stand down!" Alara looked at him. Her expression didn't change. It was the look one might give a noisy insect before crushing it. "I am your wife, Julian," she said calmly. "That is true. But property, I think you will find that the marriage contract you signed with Arthur Vance had specific clauses." "Arthur Vance was a merchant," Julian spat. "Arthur Vance was the former spymaster of the Valorian Empire," Alara corrected. "And he ensured that while you married Alara Vance, you held no claim over Anastasia von Habsburg-Lorraine. You married a ghost Julian, and you treated her like one." Lady Genevieve, realizing the ship was sinking rapidly, tried to slip away into the crowd. But Alara's gaze snapped to her. "Going so soon, Lady Genevieve?" Alara asked. "You were so eager to wear my husband's silk. Perhaps you would like to explain to the Valorian Prime Minister why you are wearing a gown purchased with funds from the Blackwood estate funds that are technically—" She paused, tilting her head. "Insolvent." Julian froze. "What are you talking about?" "Did you think your shipping lines were profitable, Julian?" Alara asked softly. "Your ships have been rotting in the harbor for 3 years. Your lifestyle, your gambling, your mistress. It has all been funded by a monthly stipend from the Vance estate. My estate. I have been paying for my own prison." A gasp rippled through the crowd. The humiliation was total. The wealthy, powerful Duke was revealed to be a leech living off the secret fortune of the wife he despised. "But that ends tonight," Alara announced, her voice hardening into steel. "Victor cut the funding." "Done, Your Majesty," Victor growled. "No." Julian lunged forward, panic seizing him. "You can't. We are married. What is yours is mine." Victor moved faster than a man of his size should be able to. He grabbed Julian by the lapels of his expensive tailcoat and lifted him off the ground. The Duke's feet dangled helplessly. "If you touch the Empress again," Victor whispered loud enough for the king to hear, "I will not declare war on England. I will simply dismantle you bone by bone right here on this dance floor." "Put him down, Victor," Alara said, bored. "He is wrinkling your uniform." Victor dropped Julian. The Duke collapsed in a heap of black wool and humiliation. Alara turned back to the king. "Your Majesty, I believe my husband is unwell. Perhaps he should be escorted out. I have a trade treaty to discuss with your government." King George didn't hesitate. He gestured to the royal guard. "Escort the Duke of Ashford off the premises, and Lady Genevieve as well." As the guards dragged a sputtering Julian away, he looked back at Alara. She was already turning away, taking the arm of the Prime Minister, the crimson velvet of her train sweeping over the spot where he had fallen. She didn't look back, not even once. The weeks that followed the grand ball at Windsor were not a sudden crash for the Duke of Ashford. They were a slow, agonizing suffocation. Blackwood Manor, once the envy of Mayfair, had transformed into a tomb. The heating had been cut off first. The coal merchants, owed a small fortune, simply stopped delivering. A damp chill settled into the limestone walls, seeping into the tapestries and the furniture, turning the air heavy and gray. Julian sat in the library, wrapped in a heavy wool coat he hadn't taken off in 3 days. The room was dark save for a single sputtering candle. The electricity had been cut yesterday. The silence of the house was the worst part. It used to be filled with the quiet, efficient hum of 20 servants. Now it echoed. The staff had not left quietly. They had left with the fury of people who realized they had been serving a fraud. Henderson, the elderly butler who had served the Blackwood family for 40 years, walked into the room. He carried a silver tray with a single hard crust of bread and a cup of lukewarm water. "Your lunch, sir," Henderson said. The title, Your Grace, had slipped from his vocabulary, replaced by a pitying formal "sir." "Is this it?" Julian sneered, staring at the bread. "I am the Duke of Ashford Henderson. Am I to dine like a peasant?" "It is all that is left in the larder, sir," Henderson replied, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. "And I'm afraid this will be my final service." Julian froze. You can't leave. You're part of the furniture." Henderson placed a set of keys on the desk. "The furniture has been repossessed, sir, and so has my loyalty. You had a good wife, Master Julian. She was kind. She was patient. She covered your debts and hid your shame. You didn't just lose a fortune at that ball. You lost the only person in this world who actually cared if you lived or died." The old man bowed a gesture of finality, not servitude, and walked out. The heavy front door opened and closed. Then silence. Absolute crushing silence. Julian hurled his glass against the fireplace. "I don't need you," he screamed at the empty room. "I don't need any of you. I am Julian Blackwood." His eyes fell on a thick envelope sitting on the desk. It bore the royal seal. With trembling fingers he tore it open. It wasn't just an annulment. It was an evisceration. Case: The Crown versus Julian Blackwood. Regarding misappropriation of imperial funds. He scanned the audit. It detailed every pound he had spent over the last 3 years. The renovations paid for by the Vance Trust. His gambling debts cleared by the Vance Trust. Even the diamond necklace he had bought for his mistress, Lady Genevieve, was listed. Julian felt bile rise in his throat. The audit showed that Alara had personally signed the authorization for the necklace, categorizing it under charitable donations to the needy. She had known. She had always known. She hadn't been jealous. She had been pitying him. She had been funding his affair because to her he was just a child playing dress-up. "She played me," Julian whispered, his mind fracturing under the weight of his own ego. "She made a fool of me." But then a desperate, delusional thought took root. "She can't rule alone," he thought frantically. "She is an empress, but she is a woman. She needs a consort. She needs an Englishman to navigate the West. She's just hurting. If I go to her, if I show her I'm sorry, she'll take me back." He grabbed his coat and ran out of the manor. He didn't have a carriage. The horses were gone, so he walked. It was 5 miles to the Valorian embassy. As he walked, the London sky opened up, unleashing a torrent of freezing rain. Julian trudged through the sludge, his fine leather boots soaking through. By the time he reached the embassy, he looked less like a duke and more like a beggar. The embassy was a fortress of light against the storm. The Valorian flag whipped violently in the wind. The gates were locked, guarded by 2 giants in black and gold uniforms. "Open the gate!" Julian screamed, gripping the cold iron bars. "I am the Duke of Ashford. I am the Empress's husband." The guards didn't blink. They stared through him. "Don't ignore me." Julian rattled the gates. "Tell her Julian is here. Tell her I've come to take her home." A viewing hatch slid open. Prime Minister Victor Crumb's scarred face appeared. He looked at Julian with terrifying indifference. "The Empress has no home in England," Victor said, his voice gravelly. "And she has no husband. The marriage has been annulled." "Let me speak to her." Julian sobbed, the rain mingling with his tears. "Just 5 minutes, I love her." Victor turned his head. "Your Majesty, do you wish to address this petitioner?" Julian's heart stopped. Through the rain he saw her. Alara stood under the portico, sheltered from the storm. She wore a traveling suit of deep purple velvet, a hat with a dark veil pinned to her hair. She looked vibrant, powerful, and utterly out of his league. She walked slowly toward the gate, stopping just out of reach. A footman held a black umbrella over her. "Alara!" Julian gasped, falling to his knees in the mud. He reached a hand through the bars. "My darling, look at me. I'm sorry. I was a fool. But I can change. Take me with you to Valoria. I'll serve you." Alara lifted her veil. Her eyes were clear and cool. "And what would you do in Valoria, Julian? Would you advise me on finance? You bankrupted your estate. Would you advise me on loyalty? You betrayed your vows daily." "I love you," Julian cried. "I love you more than life." "No, Julian," she said softly. "You love the status. You see the crown and you want to wear it. You see the army and you want to command it. You don't see me. You never saw me." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small gold ring, the cheap wedding band he had given her 2 years ago. "You told me once that this ring was the only thing giving me value," she said. "You told me I was invisible without you, but I am the daughter of emperors. My bloodline ruled continents while your ancestors were still herding sheep. I do not need your ring to have value, and I certainly do not need you." She tossed the ring. It sailed through the bars and landed with a wet plop in a dirty puddle at his feet. "You wanted to be master of your house, Julian. Now you are master of nothing. You are the only man in history to have divorced an empress. That is your legacy." She turned her back on him. "Alara!" "No, don't turn away!" Julian screamed, thrusting his arm through the bars, straining to touch the hem of her coat. "I command you, stop!" She didn't pause. She stepped into the waiting carriage. Victor Crumb looked at Julian one last time, a look of pure disgust, and slammed the viewing hatch shut. The massive gates groaned open, but not for Julian. A convoy of 6 black carriages thundered out, splashing mud all over him. He stood frozen, watching the red taillights fade into the night. He was alone. He looked down at the puddle. The gold ring glinted dully in the murky water. Julian dropped to his knees, plunging his hands into the freezing mud. "Where is it? Where is it?" he sobbed, clawing at the dirt until he found it. He clutched the muddy ring to his chest, curling into a ball on the pavement. He rocked back and forth, crying for the life he had burned down with his own arrogance. Passers-by gave him a wide berth. They didn't see a duke. They didn't see a gentleman. They saw a raving lunatic in the gutter clutching a piece of gold that was now worth absolutely nothing. The invisible woman had vanished into greatness, and the man who demanded to be seen was finally truly alone in the dark. The fall of the House of Blackwood did not happen with a bang, but with the scratching of a pen on a foreclosure notice. 2 weeks after the incident at Windsor, the morning fog in London was thick and yellow, clinging to the windows of Blackwood Manor like a shroud. Inside the house was no longer a home. It was a carcass being picked clean. Julian stood in the center of the grand foyer, watching in a catatonic daze as men in rough wool coats hauled his life away. The bailiffs were efficient and merciless. They carried out the mahogany dining table where he had sat alone for so many meals. They took the grandfather clock that had chimed the hour of his birth. They even took the silver candelabras, tossing them into crates with a careless clatter that made Julian flinch. "Careful with that." Julian snapped, his voice raspy from days of drinking cheap gin. "That portrait is a Gainsborough. It has been in my family for 4 generations." The head bailiff, a burly man with a clipboard, didn't even look up. "It belongs to the Bank of London now, Mr. Blackwood, and considering the size of your debts, they'll be lucky to get a shilling on the pound for it." "Mr. Blackwood." "Not your grace. Not my lord." The title had been stripped from him alongside the assets suspended pending the investigation into his fraud. Henderson, the loyal butler who had served Julian's father, walked down the stairs carrying a single battered suitcase. He wore his coat and hat, looking smaller and older than Julian had ever seen him. "The staff have all gone, sir," Henderson said softly. "The scullery maid left an hour ago. Cook took the copper pans in lieu of her unpaid wages." "You're leaving too, then?" Julian asked, a bitter smile twisting his lips. "Abandoning the sinking ship. I have served this family for 40 years, Henderson said, his voice trembling with a mixture of sadness and disappointment. "I stayed because I hoped you would become the man your father was. But I see now that the rot is too deep." He paused at the door. "You had a queen in your kitchen, sir, and you treated her like a scullery maid. That is a sin no amount of money can absolve." The door closed with a final echoing thud. Julian was alone. He wandered through the empty rooms, the floorboards creaking beneath his boots. The house echoed with the ghosts of his own arrogance. He remembered standing in the drawing room mocking Alara's dress. He remembered laughing at her when she asked for money to buy new ribbons. Invisible, he had called her. He walked to the window where she used to stand waiting for him. The glass reflected his own face, hollow-cheeked, unshaven eyes, bloodshot and wild. He didn't recognize himself. He had defined his entire existence by his status, by his name, by his possessions. Without them, he was nothing. He was a husk. A loud banging on the front door startled him. It wasn't a visitor. It was the locksmith come to change the bolts. The bank was seizing the property. Julian grabbed his coat, the only one he had left, the velvet collar stained and fraying, and stumbled out into the rain. He had nowhere to go. No friends would take him. He had borrowed money from all of them and insulted their wives. Lady Genevieve had publicly denounced him, claiming she was a victim of his deceit, saving her own reputation while destroying what was left of his. He began to walk. He walked away from Mayfair, away from the parks and the palaces, descending into the gray labyrinthine streets of East London. He was walking toward the only place that would take him, a grim boarding house in Whitechapel, not far from the clock shop, where Alara had reclaimed her destiny. Till 3,000 miles away, the sun was rising over the silver mountains of Valoria. The air here was different. It was crisp, smelling of pine and snow, a stark contrast to the coal-choked smog of London. The capital city Aurelia was a sea of activity. Flags of crimson and gold snapped in the wind from every balcony, every lamppost, every window. In the royal palace, Ilara, now Anastasia, stood before a tall mirror in the dressing chambers. She was no longer the shrinking woman in gray wool. Her posture was erect, her chin held high. Handmaidens fluttered around her, adjusting the layers of her coronation robes. The undergown was made of white silk, representing purity and rebirth. Over it went the heavy mantle of deep crimson velvet, embroidered with thousands of tiny gold lilies, the symbol of her house. Victor Crumb stood by the door, dressed in his full ceremonial uniform, his chest heavy with medals. He watched her with a look of fierce protective pride. "You look like your mother," Victor said, his voice gruff with emotion. "But stronger. She was a flower. You are the sword that protects the garden." Anastasia turned to him. "Do you think I can do this?" Victor, ruling is not like surviving. Survival is a quiet, desperate thing. Ruling requires a voice that shakes the earth. You silence the British aristocracy with a single look. Victor smiled, the scar on his cheek crinkling. "You brought the Duke of Ashford to his knees without lifting a finger. You have the voice, Your Majesty. You just need to let the world hear it." A trumpet blast echoed from the cathedral square below. The sound vibrated through the stone walls of the palace. "It is time," Victor said, offering his arm. They walked through the long corridors lined with the restored portraits of her ancestors. As she stepped out of the palace gates and onto the processional route, a roar went up that was deafening. It wasn't polite applause. It was a primal, joyful scream from 100,000 throats. People were weeping, throwing flowers, reaching out just to touch the hem of her carriage as it passed. These were people who had suffered under the warlords, who had starved, who had lost hope. To them, her return wasn't just political. It was miraculous. Anastasia waved her gloved hand steady, but inside her heart was hammering. She looked at the faces in the crowd, weather-beaten, tired, but shining with hope. "I will not fail you," she vowed silently. "I spent years being invisible so that I could see you. I know what it is to be powerless, and I will never let you feel that way again." The carriage arrived at the great cathedral of Aurelia. The massive oak doors stood open, revealing an interior blazing with candlelight and gold leaf. The incense was thick and sweet. She walked down the aisle alone. The heavy train of her robe dragged behind her, a physical representation of the weight of the state. She reached the altar and knelt on the velvet cushion. The patriarch of the church, an ancient man with a beard like spun silver, stepped forward, holding the crown of lilies. It was a masterpiece of medieval craftsmanship. Heavy gold vines woven together, blooming with diamond flowers. "Anastasia Ilara, von Habsburg-Lorraine," the patriarch intoned, his voice echoing in the vaulted ceiling. "Do you swear to protect the weak, to uphold the law, and to serve the people of Valoria until your last breath?" "I swear it," she said clearly. Her voice did not waver. "Then rise," the patriarch said, placing the heavy crown upon her head. "Rise, Empress of the East." She stood up and turned to face the congregation. The organ music swelled a triumphant anthem that shook the stained glass windows. In that moment, Ilara Vance was dead. The woman who had counted pennies for the butcher, the woman who had cried herself to sleep while her husband entertained a mistress, was gone. In her place stood a monarch. Back in London, the rain had turned to sleet. Julian sat in the corner of a crowded, smoky pub in Whitechapel. The air smelled of stale beer and unwashed bodies. He was huddled over a pint of dark ale, clutching it with hands that were dirty and shaking. He had sold his cufflinks, the last of his jewelry, to pay for a week's rent in a room that had rats in the walls. He wore a rough workman's coat he had found in a charity bin, having sold his velvet one. No one in the pub looked at him twice. To them, he was just another broken man in a city full of them. "Oi, turn it up!" a docker shouted at the barman. "It's starting!" The barman cranked the volume on the large wireless radio sitting on the shelf. The crackling static cleared, replaced by the crisp, clipped tones of a BBC announcer. We are now crossing live to Aurelia for the coronation address of Her Imperial Majesty Empress Anastasia. The scenes here are indescribable, ladies and gentlemen. The joy is palpable. Julian stiffened. He stared at the radio, mesmerizing horror gripping him. Then her voice cut through the noise of the pub. It was strange to hear it over the airwaves. It sounded distorted, metallic, yet undeniably her. It was the same voice that used to ask him if he wanted tea. The same voice that had whispered, "I am your wife," in the dark. "My people," Anastasia's voice said. "For 20 years I walked in the shadows. I lived among those who had nothing. I learned that the true measure of a nation is not the gold in its vaults, but the dignity of its poorest citizen." The pub went silent. Rough men with coal-stained faces took off their caps. "I was told once that I had no status," the voice continued. Julian flinched as if he had been slapped. "I was told that without a title I was invisible. But I tell you now, no one is invisible. Every soul has worth. And those who seek to build their height by standing on the backs of others will always eventually fall." A cheer went up in the London pub. "That's right," the docker yelled. "She's talking about the toffs good on her." Julian shrank into his coat. The irony was a physical pain in his chest. She was speaking to the world, inspiring millions, but those specific words, they were a message, a final echo of their life together. He remembered the anniversary night. He remembered standing over her, feeling so tall, so powerful. He had held all the cards. He had the money, the title, the freedom. Now he looked at his reflection in the bottom of his empty glass. He had nothing. And worst of all, he knew exactly why. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't the economy. It was his own cruelty. He had held a diamond in his hand and thrown it into the mud because he was too stupid to wipe off the dirt. "Another pint, mate?" the barman asked, wiping down the counter. I can't pay for it," Julian whispered. "Then get out," the barman sneered. "We don't serve beggars here. This is a celebration for a proper queen, not a flophouse for tramps." Julian stood up, his legs unsteady. He stumbled toward the door. As he pushed it open, the wind caught it, slamming it against the wall. "Long live the Empress!" the radio screamed. "Long live the Empress!" The pub patrons roared in response, raising their glasses. Julian stepped out into the freezing sleet. The door slammed shut behind him, cutting off the warmth and the light. He stood on the street corner, the icy rain soaking through his thin coat. He looked up at the sky, but there were no stars tonight, only the crushing, indifferent gray of London. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the only thing he had kept, the simple gold wedding band she had thrown at him through the embassy gates. It was cold against his skin. He brought it to his lips, his body shaking with a sob that he had been holding back for weeks. "Forgive me, Alara," he whispered into the darkness. "Forgive me." But the wind snatched his words away, carrying them down the gutter, unheard, unanswered, and utterly irrelevant. He was a ghost, now haunting a city that had forgotten his name, while the wife he scorned sat on a throne of gold, bathed in the light of a new dawn. The King of Fools bowed his head and walked into the night. What a satisfying ending. Julian got exactly what he deserved, left in the mud with nothing but his regrets, realizing too late that his worthless wife was the most valuable thing he ever had. It's a powerful reminder that true nobility isn't about titles or money, it's about character. Julian's arrogance cost him an empire, while Alara's patience and dignity won her the world. If you enjoyed this story of royal revenge and justice, please give this video a like. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell notification so you never miss a new drama. And tell me in the comments, do you think Julian deserved a harsher punishment, or was living with his regret the ultimate torture? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.